The house felt eerily quiet as Henry sat across from Sarah in the warm glow of the living room fireplace. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together, gathering his thoughts. For years he had imagined this moment, explaining the truth of her disappearance, but now words failed him. "I want to tell you about the day you vanished," Henry began softly. His voice thick with emotion, he looked up at Sarah, who sat still, her expression torn between curiosity and fear. "It was an ordinary day, just like any other. You were playing in the front yard. Your mother and I were inside preparing lunch, and then you were gone." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her hand instinctively reaching for the golden pendant she wore around her neck. "Gone," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. "I ran out to find you, calling your name, Rebecca. Your mother was right behind me. We searched the yard, the street, everywhere, but you weren't there, not a single trace of you." Tears welled in his eyes as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We called the police. They searched for days, weeks, but no one had seen anything. It was as if you had disappeared into thin air. It broke. Sarah, your mother and I, we didn't know how to go on." Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edges of her chair. "And then what? What happened after I was gone?" Henry took a deep breath, his voice faltering. "I couldn't stop looking for you. I hired private investigators, put up posters, followed every lead, no matter how far-fetched, but nothing ever brought me closer to finding you. It became my life, my obsession, and your mother. She couldn't take it. The grief tore us apart." Sarah's gaze dropped to the floor, her emotions swirling like a storm. "But if you couldn't find me, how did I end up with my grandmother? How did she get me?" Henry shook his head, frustration mingling with sorrow. "That's the part I still don't know. The day I saw you at the bank with that necklace, everything came rushing back. I had to know who you were. And now I know you're my daughter." Sarah looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "All this time I thought my grandmother was my only family, that she saved me after my mother died. How could she lie to me?" Henry reached out, his voice filled with quiet desperation. "I don't have all the answers, Sarah, but together we can find the truth. We can figure out what happened and why. And maybe we can heal." Sarah hesitated, her emotions tangled in a web of gratitude and anger. She had loved her grandmother deeply, but now the foundation of her life felt like a lie. "I don't know if I can forgive her," she admitted, her voice breaking, "but I need to understand why." Henry nodded, his determination unwavering. "Then we'll do it together. We'll find out the truth no matter what it takes." As the fire crackled softly between them, the bond they shared began to mend, piece by fragile piece, but the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with questions that demanded answers, and truths that might bring as much pain as closure. The dim light in Jacob's office flickered, casting long shadows on the walls lined with old case files. Henry and Sarah sat across from him, their faces etched with anticipation and unease. Jacob, always meticulous, sifted through the papers on his desk until he found what he was looking for. A photograph, slightly faded, of Rebecca. "I found something," Jacob said, sliding the photo toward Henry and Sarah. "This was taken a few years after Sarah disappeared. Your wife, Rebecca, was spotted in a small town upstate. The man with her is Victor." Henry's eyes narrowed as he studied the photograph. Rebecca's face looked tired, her once bright eyes clouded with fear. The man beside her, Victor, had a menacing air, his hand gripping her arm tightly. "She's alive," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. "But she looks terrified." Jacob nodded grimly. Victor wasn't acting alone. He was working under Whitmore's orders. But here's the twist. Rebecca was released a few years later. She's been living in isolation ever since, convinced that Sarah's life was still in danger. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "She thought I was in danger, but why didn't she come back for me?" Jacob sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because she didn't know where you were. Victor and Whitmore kept her in the dark. When she finally escaped, she believed going to the authorities would put you at risk. So she disappeared." Henry clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as anger and sorrow clashed within him. "All these years she's been living in fear. And His voice broke and he looked at Sarah. "I can't imagine how she must have felt thinking you were lost forever." Sarah stared at the photo, her hands trembling. The image of her mother, the woman she barely remembered, stirred something deep within her. "Where is she now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jacob reached for another document, sliding it across the desk. "A friend of mine tracked her to a remote cabin in the mountains. She's been living there, off the grid. If you want to find her, that's where you'll need to go." Henry looked at Sarah, his determination clear. "We have to go. She needs to know the truth, that you're alive, that we found you." But Sarah hesitated, her emotions swirling. What if she doesn't want to see us? What if she blames herself? Henry placed a hand on hers, his voice steady. "Then we show her that she doesn't have to carry this alone. We're a family, Sarah, and it's time we find our way back to each other." The journey to Rebecca's cabin was long and winding. The narrow road flanked by dense forest. Sarah stared out the window, her thoughts tangled in a web of hope and fear. Max, ever watchful, rested his head on her lap, sensing her unease. Henry drove in silence, his grip on the wheel tight, his mind racing with memories of Rebecca and the life they had lost. When they finally reached the cabin, the sight before them was both humbling and heartbreaking. The small wooden structure stood alone, its roof weathered by years of neglect. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign that someone was home. Henry stepped out first, his breath visible in the crisp mountain air. He turned to Sarah, who clutched Max's leash tightly, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. Together they approached the door. Henry raised his hand to knock, but hesitated, his nerves getting the better of him. Finally he rapped softly, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a long moment the door creaked open. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her face pale and lined with years of worry. Her eyes widened as she saw Henry, and then they fell on Sarah. Her hand flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her lips. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice breaking. Sarah took a step forward, tears streaming down her face. "Mum!" Rebecca's legs buckled, and Henry caught her just in time. "It's okay," he said softly, holding her close. "We're here now. You're not alone anymore." Rebecca looked up at Sarah, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch her daughter's face. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They told me you were gone." Sarah knelt beside her, taking her hands in hers. "I'm here, Mom. I'm here." As the three of them embraced, years of pain and separation melted away, but beneath the joy of reunion lay the unspoken truth. The journey ahead would not be easy. They had found each other, but now they had to rebuild what had been broken. The cabin's warmth did little to thaw the decades of pain that hung in the air. Rebecca sat in the center of the modest living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes flitted between Henry and Sarah. As if she couldn't trust her own senses, Max lay by the fireplace, his steady breathing the only sound in the room. "Rebecca," Henry began softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We've been searching for so long, I never stopped looking for you. For Sarah, I thought I'd lost you both." Rebecca looked down, her shoulders trembling. I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "When they let me go, I couldn't risk coming back. I didn't know where Sarah was, and I was so afraid. Afraid that if I showed myself, they'd find her." Sarah watched her mother with a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. Gratitude, yes, but also confusion and anger. How could the woman who had brought her into this world have stayed hidden, even if it was out of fear? "You didn't even try." Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. The words came out sharper than she intended. "You left me behind." Rebecca flinched as if struck, her face etched with guilt. "I didn't know where to start by the time I escaped. They'd made sure all the trails were cold, I thought. I thought the best way to protect you was to stay away." Henry stepped forward, his hand resting gently on Rebecca's shoulder. "You did what you thought was right, but now we're here, we're together." Sarah shook her head, standing abruptly. "You don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face. "All these years I thought my grandmother was the only family I had. She told me my mother was gone, that she died, and now you're telling me that you were out there, alive." "Sarah," Rebecca pleaded, her voice trembling. "I was trying to protect you. Everything I did for you. But I didn't know you." Sarah shot back, her voice rising. I grew up believing I had no one but her. How am I supposed to just rebuild a relationship with someone who feels like a stranger?" The words cut deeply, and for a moment the room fell silent. Henry looked between the two women, his heart breaking as the distance between them seemed insurmountable. "Sarah," Henry said gently, "your mother has carried the weight of this pain for years. She's here now, and so are you. This is our chance to heal." Rebecca wiped her tears, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Sarah. I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. I've always loved you." Sarah turned away, her hands clenched at her sides. Max stirred, sensing the tension in the room, and padded over to nudge her hand. She looked down at him, the steady comfort of his presence grounding her. "I don't know if I can do this," she murmured. Henry stepped closer, his voice firm but kind. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. We've all been broken by this, but we can only move forward if we face it together." Rebecca reached out hesitantly. "Please, Sarah, let me prove to you that I'm here to stay." Sarah looked at her mother, the raw vulnerability in her eyes breaking through her anger. Slowly, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "All right, but this isn't going to be easy." Rebecca nodded, a small, hopeful smile breaking through her tears. "I understand." The fire crackled softly, casting a golden glow over the room. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. For the first time in years, the three of them shared a space, not just as individuals, but as a family piecing itself back together. Sarah stood on the front porch of her grandmother Martha's modest home, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar creak of the wooden steps beneath her feet felt heavier than ever before. She wasn't the child who had spent countless afternoons running up and down them. She was a woman, carrying the weight of betrayal and unanswered questions. The door opened slowly, and there stood Martha, her face a mixture of warmth and concern. "Sarah, what are you doing here so late, dear?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "We need to talk, Grandma, about everything." Martha hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorframe. Her eyes darted past Sarah to Henry, who stood silently at the foot of the porch, his expression unreadable. "Come inside," Martha said quietly, stepping aside. The living room felt smaller than Sarah remembered. The familiar scent of lavender mixed with the faint aroma of the tea Martha had been brewing as they sat down. The tension in the room was palpable. Max settled by Sarah's feet, his presence grounding her. "Grandma," Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly, "I found my parents, my real parents." Martha's face paled, and her hands fidgeted with the edge of her apron. "Sarah, Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "Why did you let me grow up thinking my mother was dead? That I had no one else in the world but you?" Martha's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the question physically pressed down on her. "I did what I thought was best," she said softly. "You were so young, Sarah. I thought keeping you safe was more important than the truth." "Safe from what?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp with pain. "From knowing who I really am from my parents." Martha's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out a trembling hand. "Sarah, please understand. When Victor brought you to me, he said it was the only way to keep you from being hurt, he told me. Your father was powerful, dangerous, and that you needed to be hidden. I believed him." Henry stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Martha, Victor lied to you. I've spent years searching for Sarah. She was stolen from me, from her mother. I would have done anything to protect her." Martha looked at him, her expression a mix of guilt and sorrow. "I didn't know. I thought I was saving her." Sarah stood, her hands clenched into fists. "You didn't save me, Grandma. You stole me. You lied to me every day of my life. Do you know what it feels like to find out everything you believed was a lie?" Martha began to sob, her frail frame shaking. "I loved you, Sarah. I did my best to give you a good life." Sarah's anger faltered, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. "I know you loved me, and I loved you too, but that doesn't erase what you did." The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Henry stepped closer to Sarah, his presence a quiet support. After a long moment, Sarah turned to her grandmother. "I need time to process this, to figure out how to move forward." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand, my darling. I'm so sorry." Meanwhile, Jacob stood outside, pacing the driveway, as he reviewed the files he'd uncovered on Whitmore. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and the picture they formed was dark and twisted. When Henry stepped outside to join him, Jacob handed him a manila folder. "I found something," Jacob said grimly. "Whitmore wasn't just trying to hurt you, Henry. He manipulated Victor into taking Sarah. But his target was always you. He wanted to destroy your family, your legacy." Henry's jaw tightened, his hand clenching the folder. "Why? What did I do to him that was worth all this?" Jacob looked at him, his expression heavy. "You outmaneuvered him in business. He blamed you for his downfall and thought taking Sarah would be the ultimate revenge." Henry's heart ached with the weight of the revelation. "He ruined our lives over a business deal." "Yes," Jacob said, "but we have enough to take this to the authorities. He won't get away with it." Henry looked back at the house where Sarah and Rebecca were sitting together, their silhouettes framed by the window. "Let's make sure he doesn't." Henry paced the ornate living room of Jacob's small cabin office. The dim light of the old chandelier cast a warm glow on the documents spread out across the table. Sarah sat on a faded armchair nearby, her face tense with a mix of anticipation and dread. Max, ever vigilant, rested at her feet. Jacob entered with a determined stride, holding a thick folder. "It's time," Jacob said firmly. Placing the folder in front of Henry, "Whitmore's estate is just outside of town. We have enough evidence to take him down, but you need to decide how far you're willing to go." Henry stared at the folder for a moment before looking at Sarah. "I need to face him," he said, his voice resolute. "I need him to see the consequences of what he's done." Sarah nodded, though her expression revealed her inner conflict. "I want to come with you," she said softly. Henry hesitated. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. You've been through enough." "No," she said firmly, standing up. "This is my life too. I need answers just as much as you do." Jacob nodded approvingly. "Then let's go." The drive to Whitmore's estate was silent, the tension palpable. The large iron gates loomed ahead, a symbol of the man's arrogance and power. Jacob parked just outside, and the group stepped out, their breath visible in the cold night air. The mansion was sprawling, its windows glowing faintly. Henry led the way, his steps purposeful. When they reached the front door, he rang the bell. A butler answered, his eyes widening slightly at the unexpected guests. "We're here to see Mr. Whitmore," Henry said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The butler hesitated, but eventually stepped aside. "Hi's in the study." The group followed him through the grand hallways, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. When they reached the study, the butler opened the door and announced their arrival. Whitmore was seated behind a massive oak desk, a glass of brandy in his hand. His sharp features softened briefly with surprise before hardening into his usual mask of indifference. "Henry," he said smoothly, standing. "What a surprise." "Not a social visit," Henry replied coldly. "You know why I'm here." Whitmore's eyes flicked to Sarah, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "Ah, I see. The prodigal daughter returns." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Why did you do this? Why take me away from my family?" Whitmore sighed, feigning boredom. "You wouldn't understand, my dear. It was business, a lesson your father needed to learn." "Business?" Henry barked, his voice rising. "You destroyed lives over a deal. You took my daughter, tore my family apart, and you call it business?" Whitmore took a slow sip of his brandy, his expression unreadable. "You took everything from me first, Henry. My empire, my reputation. I had nothing. I thought it was only fair to take something from you in return." Henry's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And what did you gain, James? 20 years of what? Satisfaction, revenge?" Whitmore shrugged. "It was never about gain. It was about making you feel the emptiness I felt." Sarah's voice cut through the tense silence. "You ruined my life for that, for your ego." Whitmore looked at her, something flickering in his cold eyes. "Remorse? Perhaps, but it was fleeting. You were collateral damage, nothing personal." The room fell silent again, the weight of Whitmore's indifference hanging heavily in the air. Henry stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "You will pay for what you've done, not just for me, but for Sarah, for Rebecca. You don't get to walk away from this." Whitmore's smirk returned, but it lacked conviction. And what do you plan to do, Henry? Play the hero. You've already won. You have your daughter back. Isn't that enough? No, Henry said firmly. Justice isn't about winning, it's about accountability. At that moment, Jacob stepped forward, holding up a recorder. We have everything we need, he said. Your confession, your motives, it's all here. The authorities will take care of the rest. Whitmore's composure finally cracked, his eyes narrowing. You think this will stop me? Henry leaned in, his voice deadly calm. This is the end for you, James. As they left the estate, Sarah turned to Henry. Are you okay? He nodded, though his eyes betrayed the lingering pain. I'm relieved it's over, but it doesn't erase the damage. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. We'll heal, together, as the car drove away from the estate. Henry felt a weight lifting. Justice would be served, but more importantly, he had his family. That was all that mattered. If you were moved by this heartfelt and dramatic story of a father's relentless search for his daughter and their journey to reunite their family, click on the card above to watch more emotional tales like this one. Let us know in the comments what themes or stories you'd love to see next. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel, so you never miss another inspiring story. I absolutely love reading your comments. They inspire me to create even more meaningful stories for you.